Namaskar. Another 300 Indians were evacuated from Aden and they arrived in Djibouti today and they are expected to reach home tonight. Minister of State for External Affairs, General V.K. Singh, who is overseeing evacuation operations, thanked the Djibouti Foreign Minister for his cooperation in the evacuation efforts. 360 Indian nationals evacuated from Yemen had landed in Kochi and Mumbai international airports early this morning. And India will also help in the evacuation of stranded Sri Lankans from Yemen. There are reportedly around 75 to 100 Sri Lankan expatriates, including students in Yemen, due to the volatile situation in the country, and Sri Lanka is making arrangements to evacuate all Sri Lankans in Yemen and has requested government of India to help in this evacuation. Well, fighting continues in the Yemen city of Aden, with Houthi rebels trying to seize control of the city. There were heavy clashes between local militia fighters and the rebel forces, increasing concerns over the number of casualties. The fierce fighting has continued despite airstrikes on Houthi forces by Saudi-led coalition. According to reports, the hospitals in Aden have received more than 500 injured people from all sides in the conflict of the last 2 weeks. At least 35 workers were also killed by a blast at a dairy factory in the Red Sea port city of Hudaydah, and the UN has expressed alarm at the rising number of civilian deaths in Yemen. Well, joining us for an in-depth discussion on the situation in Yemen and the evacuation efforts there, we are joined by Dr. Sreeram Chaulia, Professor and Dean at the Jindal School of International Affairs. And thank you very much, gentlemen, for being with us. Dr. Chaulia, we'll start with you. Why is Yemen so strategically important that, this fight is happening in the first place?
Well, it's the location, the geography explains some of it. It's at the mouth of the Red Sea, and southern Yemen is right across the Bab al-Mandab Pass, through which a lot of maritime commerce and oil passes. So all the more reason why it will have an impact upon oil prices, and it's got whole market spooked about what's going on there. And it's also linked to, of course, the big geostrategic rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And it's taken on a very sectarian tone, which is very disturbing. And the Saudi invasion has compounded the matters, has increased the, escalated the crisis, and has also led to a lot of civilian losses and casualties. And now there is a fear that, the proxy war that we were seeing in the Middle East between the so-called Shia bloc under Iran and the Sunni bloc under Saudi is now become an open hot war, because Saudis are directly bombing and they're talking about potentially even doing a ground invasion. So controlling Yemen has always been a Saudi preoccupation. They think it's like one of their provinces, and they're now afraid of the Iranian infiltration and expansion. And I think in the process, the ordinary civilians of Yemen, as well as our citizens and others who have been gone there as workers, are suffering.
This coalition then, Dr. Chaulia, I mean, it's a coalition of Arab states, plus it has Egypt, Morocco, Pakistan and Sudan, Jordan. This coalition claims that Iran is supporting the Houthis. Is that all that there is in this, for an entire coalition to be fighting?
Well, the Iranian support is there.
What about Al-Qaeda? What about Islamic State? What about those elements?
So, well, the Americans are saying that they are supporting this coalition because their concern is to counter Al-Qaeda, which is in the southern provinces. And in fact, Al-Qaeda has utilized this chaos to also free a lot of its inmates in Hadramaut province and so on. So, if you look at the mosaic, it's like there are Al-Qaeda controlled governorates. There are what are called the, the southern movement, which is in the past, going back to the colonial times, sense of separation. They are controlling some of the provinces, and then the Houthis themselves have been coming down from their traditional Sada province in the north down south. So you have a kind of a territorial, it's like a rush, and they're all trying to capture territory. The Iranian angle, I think, is overblown, because Iran doesn't actually have a means to supply weapons and refuel the Houthis as much as Saudi has for its proxies on the ground. So I think they're just creating a bogey, because for a lot of these Sunni Arab monarchies, Iran is a kind of a bogey to divert from their domestic failures and governance problems. And for them, everything is an Iranian threat, everything is a Shia crescent, that, as Jordan's king had once mentioned it. So it's a big conspiracy behind which they are able to try and secure and fortify their own regimes, and to also play regional politics in such a way that they can control their neighboring countries, so in a way to avert any kind of revolution. So I see this as a kind of a counter-revolutionary move led by the Saudis, and the Egyptians are there now because Egypt is so dependent on Saudi for their own existence in terms of development aid and so on. So unfortunately, Egypt's army and Saudi's money together are playing havoc in the region.
Dr. Chaulia, let's turn to some of the evacuation efforts now, because you see, I mean, we have our former army chief, who's Minister of State for External Affairs. It's a war zone, and he is overseeing the activities. We have about 4,000 Indians there. Most of them are nurses, and the way was there was the INS Sumitra, which got them away to Djibouti, and from Djibouti they've been flying back to India via Air Force planes. So that's the modus operandi. But the dangerous portion is for the naval vessels to be operating in that region. There are 3 naval vessels that will be operating now. There will be 2 Air Force planes and 2 Air India planes, which are involved in this evacuation efforts. How do you view this?
Well, we've got to do our duty towards our citizens. This region has been in flames ever since the Arab Spring began, and there was, as I said, a counter-revolutionary move by the conservative powers to turn the revolution into full-fledged wars, which we are seeing now. So be it the ISIS violence in Iraq and Syria, or what we are seeing in Yemen. Earlier there was a tumult in Bahrain, again, where the Saudis did something similar as what they're doing in Yemen today. All these, I think, unfortunately, I think at a level of policy, we also have to think about our assets there in terms of our human personnel, our people who have gone to work, our overseas workers. Maybe we need to have a more constant presence in this region in terms of our Navy to be able to, anticipate some of these, because it looks like this Middle East turmoil is just spinning out of control completely, and with American complicity in the whole thing, unfortunately. So all this means is that, we have to be prepared for more and more such emergencies, and to be on a war footing under our government to be able to pull out our people in the nick of time and save lives. Remember that those 39 Indians who were abducted in Mosul, in Iraq, are still unaccounted for. We don't know what happened to them when ISIS had abducted them. So therefore, I think it's a great humanitarian tragedy that we are witnessing, compounded by the ugly regional politics and the sectarian violence.
Right. Dr. Chaulia, speaking of diplomacy, when there's a war going on, a full-blown war, what are the chances of a diplomatic solution?
I think the principals who are behind these regional, the ones who are fighting to death, should pull back their proxies. Basically that's the problem. I mean, the Americans have given a kind of a blank check to Saudis to do whatever they want, do aerial bombardment all over the place, kill lots of civilians. No condemnation from the White House yet about what the Saudis are doing, even though it's leading to huge losses. The UN is condemning it, but not United States government. So I think, at the end of the day, to de-escalate these kind of crises, you need the big powers who are behind and who are, in a way, stoking these fires. What are the Saudi planes we're talking about? These are F-15s, and, these are drones that are given by the Americans that are being used to kill civilians. So I think they have a responsibility. Of course, Iran should also play a more responsible role and should restrain their proxies.
But when it is entirely in... when the balance seems to be tilted in favor of the coalition, the war should be over very fast.
I don't think so. On the ground, Houthis are very strong. And remember, around 45 to 50% are Zaidi in the country. The remaining 50, many of them found the Houthis to be liberators across sectarian lines, because they were talking about corruption and injustices of the previous regime that was backed by the Saudis and the Gulf Cooperation Council. So I think on the ground, they don't have a force to be able to dislodge the Houthis. So we're looking at a long war of attrition, which unfortunately mean lots of casualties. And the Saudi attitude has been far more, aggressive this time under the new king and the new defense minister, Prince Mohammed, where they're saying, earlier we were only funding and financing proxies, now we're going to go into open war. So I think it's a very dangerous turn. It may even destabilize the Iran nuclear deal in the long run, which is still being negotiated.
Dr. Chaulia, what does this do to the balance of power in the region? I mean, the entire region, including the Arab-Israeli situation.
I think this is an attempt to correct what the Saudis claim to be like an imbalance growing in Iran's favor. Because in Iraq and in Syria, it is the Shiite militias backed by Iran that seem to be prevailing. And same is the case in Lebanon, where they have Hezbollah. So Yemen, I think they are saying that this is our red line, where we won't allow Iranian influence to expand. And their anxiety is compounded by the fact that the Americans are now dealing with Iran. So I think the more there is rapprochement between Iran and the United States, the more the Saudis are going to stoke and pour fuel on fire across the region. And I think in the end of this, you will not get, it's not a question of balance. It's about, lives being lost. There's total terror from the air and on the ground. And I think this is going to create room for ISIS and Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb and these kind of groups to come forward and take charge in many of these, vacuums that are being created as a result of state failure, which are engineered from outside.
Dr. Chaulia, the Islamic State, how is it viewing this particular conflict?
As Captain is saying, it has been an Al-Qaeda bastion, but recently they committed a number of suicide attacks in mosques against the Houthis, killing hundreds of them inside Yemen. So IS is gaining ground, especially because even in Iraq and Syria, it is seen to be a kind of a bulwark against the spreading Shia influence. So the same logic will now mean that some of these southern forces, the Sunni Arab monarchies, backed by, may even in fact tacitly cooperate with Al-Qaeda and with IS to roll back the Houthis, which they see as Iranian influence. So it takes us back to the original point, which is that United States with Iran can actually roll back and defeat IS. But what is actually happening, United States made a huge mistake in Yemen by backing this regime, and in a way it's creating a situation where Iran is going to be rolled back in Yemen, and what that means is it's bad news because Al-Qaeda is gaining.
Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us here on this special program. Well, the conflict in Yemen has mutated into a full war. The Houthi rebels had joined the protests against President Saleh during the Arab Spring in 2011. Now they are fighting President Hadi, who is supported by the Sunni South. The Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that opposes both the Hadi and the Houthis, those groups. Now the Islamic State, it's also fighting in this fight because of the strategic importance of Yemen. And the Arab coalition, which is the Arab coalition plus Egypt, Morocco, Pakistan and Sudan, they accuse Iran of supporting the Houthis. Hence the conflict is seen as part of the regional power struggle. And of the 4,000 Indians in this region, most of them are nurses. India is putting in all its efforts to repatriate the Indians stranded there. The Prime Minister, Shri Narendra Modi, has spoken, in fact, to the Saudi king, who assured of all his help to the Indians stranded there. The Minister of State for External Affairs, General V.K. Singh, is in Djibouti, personally overseeing the efforts. 2 Air India passenger aircraft, 2 IAF C-17 Globemaster planes, 2 Shipping Corporation of India ships, 3 Indian naval vessels. They are all involved in the rescue operations. The Indian Railways, too, is making special arrangements from Mumbai to get the stranded Indians home safe and sound. Thanks for watching. Namaskar.